with Ben McAdams, one of the truly innovative leaders of his generation of smart city mayors across the country.
It was absurd that our data ended arbitrarily at one city line and didn't pick up. So we did it for the entire metro area that included all of the cities within our 1.2 million person metro area. So incredible work that you've done, and so many mayors who followed in your footsteps across the country to try to build smarter governments. So the title, as we all know, of this session is Advancing Equity Through Infrastructure Asset Leadership. And I want to get to the equity piece in a minute, but first I want to, because I think you did such a great job of tying together investments in physical infrastructure. The bridges example in Minnesota was an incredible example of showing where needs are and where dollars are spent, and then effectively making smarter government. We can invest where the needs are. So you talked about early on the silos of data, and I followed your story and your work in that area. But I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about, because I think we all encounter that in our various aspects. I saw that when I was mayor, how silos of data also mean silos of responsibility. And so it's really hard to solve challenges when you have different aspects of government or any organization saying, well, that's not my responsibility. How did you use that data to then bring people together from different silos of responsibility to solve some of the challenges that you worked on?
Yeah, there were a few, with time to reflect, I realized there were a few keys to a few key techniques. In terms of technology, the map is such a tremendous tool. It's also kind of a self-referential truth, right? I mean, you probably had this experience too, when you'd show people, the data you track and it's up on the big board, somebody will always raise their hand and say, can you show me my house? It's because they're truth testing what you're telling them as leader, because they can see it and they know, and they want to know, citizens, if you know what's going on in their neighborhood and can tell. So the technological fix was this: instead of trying to connect up and down all of those individual silos, imagine housing's a silo, transportation, health a silo, instead of trying to connect up and down or trying to make all of the collection of the data in each of those organizations standard, instead we said, look, you can keep the data however you want. You can collect it in your silo however you want, but you have to be able to land it by address on the map every 2 weeks. And so almost all data collected in the United States anyway, or in developed nations, has an address, a longitude, latitude, or a parcel. And so if those separate silos can at least open that aspect and coordinate that onto a map, I'm holding up this isn't a great demonstration of a map. That map becomes the common platform. When all of the literal databases land on the map, it's like, watching a football game on a playing field. Imagine how miserable the football game would be to watch if there weren't goal lines and yard markers. So the other two techniques are more human techniques. I found that in measuring performance and using the map to do that, you had to be really relentless. You couldn't stop. If people thought it was like a once a year annual budget thing, they would fudge and give you all sorts of reasons for why it's hard and why they can't. But when they know you're coming around every 2 weeks and fewer people are offering up those same BS excuses about why they can't land their data on the map, then people start saying, oh, hell's bells, these guys aren't going away. We might as well just open the data and make it automated instead of being forced to do it every 2 weeks. And then the third thing is this, Ben, you got to use the occasion when you bring people together in that collaborative cadence to lift up the leaders, lift up the people that are doing things well, because everybody wants to be recognized for doing things well. And that's a big shift in government, from usually punishing people for underperforming or not showing up for work. Instead, lifting up the leaders in the eyes of their peers makes the 80% of us in the middle, instead of tending towards the slackers, makes us tend towards the leaders. And the difference in this and that is nation-leading progress.
So you effectively got, one example in your book that I thought was really interesting is how you dealt with vacant housing, right? And thousands of vacant housing units. And the government was going in as government does, and you had the health department doing what they have to do, and other agencies boarding up windows, and other agencies managing title. And one of the challenges is to get all of those entities. If you go in one day and clean up trash, and then 3 weeks later go in and to board up windows, you've got trash back in the same building again. So unless the right hand and left hand are working together, you've effectively done nothing. I know when I was mayor, and when I started this effort, we had people who were really good at explaining why historically it wasn't the health department's responsibility, it was the city's, and they would want constituents who called through about why it was somebody else's responsibility. And I just, we turned that around to say, they don't care why historically it's one entity or a different agency's responsibility to take care of something. They just know whether their pothole got fixed or not, right? And they don't care who did it. They just want to know that it worked. And so I want to move it. I think first of all, that's to your point, is the changing leadership, right? That it's not just dictating, but it is a common source of truth in a collaborative fashion, working to deliver what people expect at the end of the day, which is a functioning, smart government that uses its resources effectively. I want to move this conversation to where you concluded, and that is a discussion about equity. So as we make government smarter, and GIS and Internet of Things and data is helping us to understand the world in which we live, it also gives us an incredible power to shape and change the world in which we live. And as we do this analysis, we see the world in which we live isn't always fair and equal to everyone. That structurally, we inherit investments that have been made over hundreds of years in our jurisdictions, a couple hundred years at least. And those investments haven't always been made in an equitable fashion. And those inequities actually have a cost to all of us. You look at the impact of redlining and what that meant to not only to individuals who didn't have access to opportunity for their homes and to invest in their communities, but to all of us, it meant lost investments in cities, and lost, even if you want to be crass about it, it's lost property tax revenue, because those practices had a harmful effect on generations of Americans. Talk about the opportunities, going to the title of this forum, to advance equity through infrastructure asset leadership. Your thoughts on maybe some additional opportunities we have to advance equity?
Yeah, Go ahead, Ben.
I can give an example from when I was mayor. So when I was mayor, again, we represented the entire county. I think you were consolidated city county, I think, and so no, you weren't. Yeah. So
we were our own.
You were your own jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. We did some mapping where we looked at akin to the bus routes that you were talking about. What areas of our county had the longest commute times? What areas of our county had the best and the worst access to mass transit? What areas of our county had the greatest challenges with housing affordability or access to jobs? And some of the things that we found was that we were, through our economic development plans, we were putting jobs, good paying jobs, entry-level jobs that paid $16, $17 an hour in areas of the county where there weren't employees seeking $18 an hour jobs. But if we could locate those jobs in a place where we had challenges with housing affordability and longest commute times, we could actually move the needle on 3 different equity metrics: shorten commute times, bring good paying jobs into the neighborhood, and make housing affordable in that area, just by simply, it wasn't a matter of more transit. I think that's important, but more transit, more affordable housing, but simply by having a smart economic development analysis and putting jobs where they were needed, we were solving multiple problems at once. And I think there's incredible, as we map our challenges and map our opportunities, to really address equity on multiple levels simultaneously.
Yes, so much.
Yeah.
I think all of us on this conversation, Ben, find us, at a point when the pendulum had swung from the time of Descartes to its furthest to its furthest realms in terms of specialization. I mean, as little as 2 decades ago, innovative leaders were the ones that took one department and broke it into three. Specialization, specialization. But as you found, um, there's there's what we have to be able to do now as a people is better understand the whole and better understand how to put things back together in ways that serve the mission and the common good that we share. So uh, as as a white mayor of a historically African American city, there wasn't a single day when I was not under enormous amount of political pressure, rightly placed, because I'm the mayor, to prove that we were acting in ways, in whatever we were doing, uh, that were fair and equitable, non-discriminatory, and addressed historic historic redlining uh, disadvantage and institutional bigotries and biases, not just in policing, but in economic development, in procurement for city services, in the redevelopment of neighborhoods, in where we chose to make big play sort of, job generating economic development projects versus where market forces would have made those decisions were it not for the sort of triple playoff, if you will, of bringing opportunity to underserved communities, addressing negative conditions, creating new housing. So we, I think the opportunities are many and they're there, but they don't exist in individual silos. It requires leadership that's willing to integrate the whole and has enough confidence in the intelligence and the compassion and the generosity of our neighbors to show people why this is better for the good of the whole. In the past, I mean, it seemed like when things were done, it was like a checkoff. Whether it's climate, we're doing that to placate the environmentalists. African and minority-owned businesses, we're doing that to placate African and women-owned business owners. It's not about placating constituency groups. It's about strengthening the health and the resiliency and the well-being of the whole, which is the other big shift, I think, from GDP to a genuine progress. I mean, from measuring domestic product to measuring genuine progress for all. Shifting from a simple cost benefit analysis to a slightly more complicated, but not really, social return on investment. And the degree to which, I mean, you can imagine the index, especially for historically disadvantaged communities. Does it move the needle on access? Does it move the needle on impact? Does it move it in a positive way or in a negative way across health and safety and convenience? It's just there to be done. The fact that we haven't done it doesn't mean that we're not capable of doing it. We've never had better technology. We just need higher expectations and some better and more courageous leadership, I think.
Well, and I would echo that. I think one of the exciting things about the day in which we live today is that our ability to actually impact equity is greater because of the technological tools we have right now. I want to bring Hugh Sinclair into the conversation. And Hugh, when I turn it over to you, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to introduce yourself. But we were on a call last week with Hugh, and Hugh made a comment that I thought was really insightful in this conversation about equity through asset management. So Hugh said that structural problems require structural solutions, and talked about how infrastructure, actual physical built infrastructure, roads and bridges, can impact equity for the good, and how that impacts, and for the bad, I guess, if it's done poorly, but how that impacts communities and growth in communities that has the effect of lifting not only, first and foremost, I should say, disadvantaged communities, but lifts the whole. So Hugh, why don't you take a minute and tell us your thoughts on that?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ben. My name is Hugh Sinclair. I'm the Division Manager for Asset Management at WSSC Water, which is the largest utility, water wastewater utility in Maryland. So equity certainly is, I think, the lost performance factor that we've looked on with infrastructure. And historically, I think in the story of American history, what has been lost is how decision makers made distinct choices in terms of how society was going to be developed that inherently created inequitable outcomes. We see that with redlining. We see that with development. We see that with where our highways are placed and displacement of communities and the lack of access or capability to thrive. So certainly, yes, I do believe that it is a structural problem, which was replicated in the way that we built our society, and it certainly will need a structural solution in the sense that a lot of it has to do with what are the outcomes that we're seeking and how do we engage with a plot for the future that actually allows us to realize that equity actually is the best performance measure to ensure that when we talk about the benefit of the whole, it is really in creating an equitable frame of reference and therefore an equitable plan through equitable design that we undergird communities which live on the girders of infrastructure to actually be able to develop. And certainly what we're seeing now is that in many of our cities, especially in our urban areas, what we're dealing with in terms of our investments is that we're actually trying to mitigate our poor infrastructure design from previous times before. Or traffic is generated around the fact that we placed our highways at the dividing line between certain communities in our cities, right? Or water systems were developed based on not only how redlining affected where growth was most possible, but certainly the level of service that was there. But I certainly would want to expand on what Governor O'Malley said, where really the metric that really allows us to figure out if we're having a real result or ROI on equity is equity in level of service. Every citizen's expectation that their outcome based on the infrastructure that is really an investment into the entire community is based on an equitable delivery of the level of service that is provided by that infrastructure.
So Hugh, let me just push you a little bit further on that. And you talk about equity and level of service, maybe an ROI on our infrastructure investments that are done in an equitable fashion. What policy tools? So when Governor O'Malley, he talks very effectively about leadership and leadership for today's day and age, which is not authoritative top down, but is collaborative around a common truth. And so if we have, as you say, we've talked about an equity index, and we want to have equitable equity and levels of service with our infrastructure investments. If that is our truth, how do we coalesce and rally government resources around achieving that shared truth?
Certainly, I believe that it is in the power of the purse that we'll be able to make the most effective change through this. Certainly, what we have done over time in response to more efficiency in capital investment is that we've created various metrics of return on that investment that are tailored toward either growth or tailored towards specific outcomes. The one part of our community that has been left behind is really the return on investment from an equity perspective. So really through the appropriations process, whether that is either in how you engage to appropriate the funds or in the promissory return that you're going to get from the investment or the use of that capital. We need to create a return on that investment from a capital disbursements and appropriations perspective for the use of that capital. That in itself will drive the decision makers and then also those who are in charge of implementation to really have a focal point as to not only just the direct GDP driven, as Governor O'Malley said, outcomes, but certainly how are we reshaping and reframing the equitable outcome and equitable future of our communities? Because from my perspective, I tend to think of a quote that Charles Darwin said that is very applicable to what we're saying now. Is that Charles Darwin said that it is not really the strongest, it is not the fastest, but the most adaptable that are most willing and capable of managing change. And in this situation now, certainly as Governor O'Malley has said, with the use of information and the contextualizing of that information, we now have all the tools that are capable that allow us to be most adaptable to create an outcome where finally, we've used it for a long time that, the rising tide that lifts all boats, that tide is equity.
So we see two pieces of legislation right now working their way through Congress, right? One, a infrastructure, more traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges, investment in our communities, and another referred to as the human infrastructure plan. I would invite other panelists as well to weigh in on these two different proposals, how we deploy these assets in a way that that is smart, that we have a smart government that not only uses those dollars wisely to, I know as a mayor, as much as those bills are going to provide needed resources to cities, it's not going to solve all of our problems. We're going to have infrastructure and roads and bridges that are still going to need maintenance. We have to think about how we spend those dollars wisely to get the actual return on investment to the built environment that we provide. We fix roads and bridges and create new infrastructure where needed, but also to this point of an ROI on equity. So I'd invite maybe, and if you're weighing in for the first time, please take a moment, introduce yourself, and then I'd love comments on that.
Okay, Mildred Chua, formerly Program Executive for Asset Management at MTA, also Vice President CFO for one of the operating agencies, which was Bridges and Tunnels. And first, I thank you, Governor O'Malley, for your comments. It brought it home to me, especially your Minnesota Bridge collapse scenario, because that was the time when I was developing the next capital program for bridges and tunnels. And we were supposed to show that, first of all, our facilities were all in a state of good repair. Traditionally, we had not gotten the funding levels that we really needed to keep our infrastructure safe and sound. So this was an opportunity for us to actually do assessments that did not stop at the descriptive. It continued on with data analytics, right? And we produced what we call the state of the system assessment of all our bridges and tunnels. And we were able to show management and leadership that we needed to double our capital program funding, that our proposal was actually very low traditionally, and that we needed to show this whole life cycle approach that would mean that we would have to invest much more than traditionally we have, and we were successful in securing that funding. So within that frame, thinking about it nationally now with the new infrastructure bill, and of course before that MAC 21 that requires a transit asset management plan to be in place to get federal funds, I do think that having a strategic asset management plan that incorporates a lot of the information, the data, the performance metrics, the results of all, your condition assessments, all of that, all wrapped up, and to show transparency in your asset base, right, is very, very important. Because if you marry that with, I see David Topman, ASCE has an infrastructure scorecard. I mean, that's one aspect of the data. I mean, you could layer in additional information that exists out there from our GIS systems and whatnot. And of course, the performance metrics that we are all developing. Transit agencies are developing many performance metrics, and included in that is equity. And the second thing I wanted to say is that equity has traditionally been built in and blended in with other types of metrics like resiliency, sustainability, state of good repair, but I think it needs to be its own. And as Hugh had mentioned, an equity score somehow would be very helpful so that it stands by itself. You can look at it from a purely equity lens, and then look at it blended in with all the other priorities of an organization so that the leadership can now have all of it in front of them and make the right decisions, because they would now begin to balance equity considerations with state of good repair, with resiliency, and come up with sort of a total investment score for a particular project that you want to put forward. So that's sort of my perspective in terms of, where I see we can head in terms of developing, a strategy or a framework for equity in asset management.
Go ahead. Yes, Cecilia, and you're muted. Please unmute and take a moment to introduce yourself.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cecilia Moat, and I'm president of Strategies Insight. And we work as a catalyst to help private and public organizations find ways to improve their processes and engage their stakeholder base better. And so one of the things that I have loved, first of all, Governor O'Malley, I just say, I love being on a panel with you because you always give me nuggets of wisdom. And I'm going to just say, from what Hugh said first, that we need to think about how we are reframing what we're doing. I'm going to take it from the top. When Jim Dieter introduced the whole program and what we're doing, and he talked about cities, he listed all the various assets of a city. But the one thing he didn't mention of what makes a city were the people. People. And one of the things that I have loved about the work and understanding I've gained through learning about ISO 55000 and 55001 mandates is 4.2, the mandate that says where we need to understand the impact on our stakeholders. And so if we're going to reframe and design, again, looking back at that Abraham Lincoln quote, I wrote it down. If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. So that was what Abraham Lincoln did. And I would add a Cecilia quote: before we can know where we are, we need to know who we are. And we often forget about who we are. And the concept of the new moving from authority to a collaborative circle centered on truth, you need to be inviting different people to the table and moving beyond the narrow definition of relevant stakeholders to a broad definition of relevant stakeholders, all the people that you may impact, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and not do it to them, but with them. So this is a situation where we're looking at equity and inclusion in a different way, not just the whole concept of we need to give people fish. No, we need to teach them to fish or learn how they are fishing, because oftentimes they're already fishing and you just don't know. So I would say that you need to start at the beginning with bringing people together to understand what they expect and need for those levels of service that they've not been getting. The mapping is one thing, but to do this properly, you need to let people tell you what they feel about what they've received and what they haven't received. And we could go into a whole nother diatribe on the issue of moving from the physical infrastructure to the human infrastructure, because I think that that is really where the money sweet spot will be for getting true return on investment. But we'll go into more discussion and let others jump in.
David, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, great. Thanks. David Topman. I'm an officer in the American Society of Civil Engineers and involved with Asset Leadership Network as I serve on the ISO committee. I almost feel like my entire career has brought me up to this conversation that we need to have, because I've been a city servant, a state government servant. I'm now, with a technology provider, and actually involved with a very important, the Aspen Nicholas Water Forums through the Aspen Institute. And we're talking about water affordability and equity. And it's this conversation that to me is like a pinnacle in my career, in that it's been very easy in infrastructure to ignore exactly what Cecilia has been talking about. Is I think I go back to my degree, and it's like I kind of avoided the humanities. I focused on mathematics. I declare, one of the things that we do at ASCE is we help educate, and we work with a bit accreditation to help shape our next generation civil engineers. And this conversation is making me believe that we need a social determinants of health class for every civil engineer, right? Because it's just a foreign concept for civil engineers to understand the value. And it's so simple with asset management, right? a tenet of asset management is assets have an intent to serve. No people, no need to have an asset, right? So Cecilia, you're spot on in what Mildred, you were saying. And so, and to Hugh's point, this maximum ROI, it's like, well, there's a big difference. And I get into conversations all the time of what's the difference between sustainability and resiliency? What's the difference between equality and equity? And the big aha moment is where you look at, to Hugh's point of kind of this maximum ROI. Well, maximum benefit really is an equity component, right? Which, say, infrastructure investment is going to give us our biggest return of value, right? And that's what we've been looking for. And to really understand resiliency, we need these, ideas on what is resiliency, what is sustainability, how does infrastructure serve, and it's going to come from people, and people have diverse backgrounds, diverse lenses of how they, participate in this society. And I think that's what, we need in this infrastructure resiliency and sustainability conversation. And it's in my involvement in this water affordability and equity and also public health, right? As engineers, we've always thought about triple bottom line, right? Financial, social, but I as a utility servant, social was always about customer satisfaction. Ooh, I want them to pay their bills. I wasn't thinking about, water as a utility they put in their body is a public health component. And as I've learned about public health and their triple aim through the APHA and AMA, some of these tenets of national health indices, public health and public infrastructure go hand in hand. They're tenets of one another. And this ability of even the conversations of, well, transportation, walkability, the digital divide. With COVID, all of our public health institutions are kind of closed, and everyone says, oh, well, just jump on our website. Well, if you don't have that cellular service, it's very hard to jump on that website, right? And so we have to, as engineers, we have to think holistically. And our triple bottom line now has to be this triple aim from the medical profession, the public health profession, and to Hugh's point of, equity and maximum value. And we all talk about value in the ALN, right? No better value can be from giving it to these, infrastructure, these disadvantaged communities, where that percent lifting up that community is going to bring them to the conversation, is going to bring, the next generation of our citizens that's going to help us through resiliency and sustainability and climate change. I mean, it just makes sense. I hope we take this recording, just play it to every US citizen, in the US and say, hey, the answers are clear. We have the technology, to Governor O'Malley's point, the map and Governor O'Malley, you and I have a friend and colleague with Jack Dangerman. I had the pleasure of serving with Jack at Esri. And, in the utility space, we get into situational awareness. I need to know everything of where I am. So where becomes very important, but also why and how and all those elements. And we have technologies today that extend GIS, that can actually bring in social determinants of health into our risk equation on how we even prioritize infrastructure, right? And if that's kind of mandated, and Governor O'Malley, you made the comment on leadership, I was a local city servant, and we were like, oh, well, we know more than the state, and the state knew more than the feds, but we need these national federal indices because we have a long-term problem and only short-term governance, right? So we need this steel thread, this target that transcends all of that. And with, say, a national infrastructure health indice or social, determinant of health indices in our infrastructure, that will transcend all these short-term governance and give us this guiding post by which we, kind of prioritize our infrastructure. So,
David, you've got Governor O'Malley's attention.
Yeah, I mean, so
let's let him comment.
Yes, we all need to be fired up.
Yeah. I see a couple hands up. I don't know if my screen's frozen or
No, we can.
Yeah.
The floor is yours, sir.
So if you wanted to share something, Governor Man, but what I think what's most important, and I think David and Governor, you hit on it the most. I think there are two key elements here in terms of infrastructure that's always undervalued. The power of advocacy, right, which is certainly linked towards the inequities and structural inequities that are there, but then also the frame of reference of decision makers. I'm a civil engineer, so I can certainly relate to what David is saying. The way that we are trained, unlike what is there for a doctor or a nurse, where really your frame of reference is that Hippocratic oath of doing no harm, right? But what we're really trained towards is really these mechanical operations of taking a problem and finding a structural solution. However, the structures and the infrastructure that we design are solely in existence to fulfill a social outcome. However, our context is sorely missing. So in that sense, I think the metric in terms of the leadership coming down certainly has to be the tool to reframe and incentivize equity. Because right now the issue, and that's why I firmly believe that is through the power of the purse, because certainly we need to incentivize making equitable outcomes for the decision makers, a focal point or a core value. And certainly with that, I believe is where we shifted, because one of the challenges certainly is the fact that equity is not an objective metric. It is very layered. And in that in itself, context in individual communities may be different. But I think a national focal point to say that equity and a return on equity, or leaning into reducing inequities from the fact that we make it an incentivized process, will certainly bring the momentum that we need. Because as we see now, even in the initial proposal of the infrastructure bill, there's about $20 billion that's put in there to reconnect communities, where it's really targeted towards transportation inequities that were created in terms of how we deployed or developed our interstate system, which created inequitable connectivity between communities. However, the problem with that is still the fact that we're leveraging that lump sum of cash. But the problem is we don't have a metric to decide how are we going to make sure that the outcomes of the intent are realized.
Mhm.
I wanted to add that in order to understand what metrics, as you said, it's very challenging to come up with what the right metrics are for equity. One of the things we could do is to, you put yourself in the shoes of your customer that you're delivering service to, right? And you map your customer journeys, different segments of the population, right? Your entire customer base, understanding them, mapping their journeys end to end for whatever service that they're receiving. And then what you will see are the pain points across that journey. And then you will begin to develop those metrics along the side of those pain points. And then you'll be able to monitor, obviously, and then better serve than that customer segment, or all customer segments. Yeah. But that is a framework that you could put together to understand, I believe, what metrics you need to have in place.
Yeah, the challenge here, I mean, at least as I see it, is that I mean, this infrastructure bill is happening fast, and democracy tends to develop slowly. So I suppose if we could imagine Congress coming together and putting riders on bills that require some really good metrics and measures and the right weighting of an index to determine. I don't think that's going to happen. I suppose we could go to the National Institute of Standards and Technology and ask them to develop an equity metric. Maybe not a bad idea, and maybe they should. But I think that what we'll probably see is that, and I do a lot of work in this space with Grant Thornton, and oftentimes going on demos, as local governments, city governments, state governments say, we know we're going to be called upon to demonstrate and show that we are acting equitably with regard to these new grant dollars or transportation or water dollars. Help us figure out how to do an equity index that passes the openness and transparency test with people. And I think what we'll probably see is that, and I don't want to take anything away from your advocacy, Michael, at the national level, or Jim or others. I mean, that's important stuff. But I'm just guessing. Most likely is that there's going to be a city or a county, a sort of Ben McAdams type of leader, man or woman, that kind of runs with us. And then we have to lift up the best practices there and share and advertise that and get the other cities and counties to apply it. And I don't mean to say that like we have to be passive rabbits accepting our fate. We're Americans. We make our own future. And the good thing about our country is that we're resilient enough that there are leaders out there in the fabric of federalism, state and local leaders, who are going to be way ahead of the federal government on being able to show and demonstrate these sorts of decisions that are being made with these dollars are actually done with an eye towards equity and addressing historic inequities.
Governor, I can address that by saying one of our members, Chris Silke from Portland, Oregon, has shared with us the asset management policy that was just passed there. And because of his involvement in this committee, there is a heavy dose of equity in the asset management policy. It could almost duplicate as an equity policy. And in our pre-event meeting, Hugh Sinclair brought up the idea of a national equity standard. In the lead up to this meeting, he's refined it to be a national infrastructure equity standard. And Jim Dieter says that we have the mechanism to go through ASTM to make that a national standard within the course of a year. So please allow us to keep you advised on how this developes.
I would just say this, we have David right here. I think one of the most effective things is that the ASC court scorecard, it is the benchmark for infrastructure across the nation. Now I know every city, mayor, county executive, governor is going to want to improve their scorecard on the framework of progression of the capital that has been invested. So certainly if it is that equity can weave its way into the evaluation of the improvement of that, I certainly believe that in itself, Governor O'Malley, may drive the outcome that you were talking about on the local level.
Okay, scorecards are good.
And I would also add, when Mildred mentioned the MAP 21 requirements that were placed on having a strategic asset management plan,
Right.
That is something that we could also be advocating for. Even while this legislation is being dealt with, we can advocate for adding that with an equity overlay that then gets people mindful, because what we need is people being mindful so that the design of whatever it is that we're going to provide in that infrastructure is addressing the needs and expectations of the various stakeholders that are going to be affected.
That's a great point. And it's only now that across the country, a lot of state and city governments are saying, I need an asset management system so I can abide by those things that were put in place. That was done at a transportation level, right? I think our former Maryland Secretary, John Pocari, was deputy secretary when those were put in place.
Right. And the next plan is actually due an update in 2022. So all the agencies are actually working on revising what was originally submitted in 2018, which was the first series of plans that were submitted.
Well, and on top of that, I think local communities and state and local cities are all looking at dealing with the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion now. And so everything that we can provide for them as a resource, as ideas for ways to manage this and begin this process of creating this cadence. I love that, the cadence of collaboration. It really can't be a one-time, one and done thing, but creating what you have talked about, Governor O'Malley, that you have a repeating cadence of collaboration, that you look for a structural solution, as Hugh has mentioned, that you find ways to tie in what will be your ROI. You've got to have a return on investment that makes sense for the community. And it's got to be something, you know, it's funny, we were looking at the issue of talent and whether talent and tolerance as being one of the things that you look at DEI. And I say instead, together, together ×4, where we are coming together, thoughtfully transforming and moving into truth is what we have to do. And so I love that circle of truth that we're going to have. We've got to start communicating with each other, using the tools, using the data, sharing with people the why that Hugh said, that we talk about the historical inequities that were created systemically, not just physically, structurally, but systemically by legislation, and the leave behinds. Because when you think about things like the fact that if you looked at all of the African Americans in this country, in the economy, we'd be the 17th largest economy in the world if you looked at the US African American population's GDP. So when people ask me why equity, equity is because everybody needs to be rising, as Hugh said, all boats need to rise. So it's an interesting thought. We mustn't say we can't do it. We must keep speaking loudly and sharing these thoughts and making others stop and think and become mindful.
Yeah, opportunity for all. There's nothing un-American about it.
No, and build back better. Don't build the same, build back better with everyone together.
Opportunity for all.
You know, I'd like to kind of, you know, put out there that, you know, the Americans say civil engineers, we've been around since 1852, so it takes time. We might be one of the more, you know, our advancements sometimes can be in geologic time, but, you know, the comments, you know, about the American report card, the infrastructure report card for America that, you know, Hugh is talking about, it is one of the, you know, one of our best marketing tools of education. And if you notice in 2017's report card, there's like no mention whatsoever of asset management. I mean, we talked about life cycle cost analysis. We talked about, you know, some of the tenets of our grand challenge and things of that nature, but you really didn't see the words even asset management show up in 2017. The 2021 report card, asset management is almost in every paragraph, which is exciting to hear. And our 2025 report card, you know, dare say that you might see the word asset management plan. And if we can start talking about these asset management plans, and that equity is an element of that plan on how you prioritize infrastructure, that can start becoming common vernacular, you know, in our industry. And so, you know, no promises. Again, it's only 4 years away, and we take a while. But, you know, that I think to bring that into the public conversation, that equity is is almost an engineering solution for infrastructure. It just makes sense, and it's a tenet of asset management in value.
And David, take heart, you know, you're way ahead of the rankings of hospitals. You know, in the ranking of the nation's hospitals, they never look at the factor of the health of the community they serve.
Yeah, but we are also behind the UK. You know, if I look across the pond, you know, social infrastructure is in their national infrastructure policies, and it's, you know, we got to catch up, you know, with those Brits.
Yeah, and the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals for the UN. I mean, definitely, it's baked in. I mean, to all of those things, they are a couple steps ahead of us on this opportunity for all mission.
But we can do it.
I would mention this one thing, and I think it was, I thought about it more in our pre-meeting, because the Ben McAdams had mentioned about the focal point of local and state officials are really looking on the challenges of trying to fix the pothole versus looking on this large thing that is determined as equity. And I think part of the problem that we need to do is to really reframe the infrastructure story of our country, because a lot of what we're dealing with right now are based on inequitable decisions in design that are now forcing us to make heavily leveraged investments in problems that if we were basing our growth plan on an equitable platform, we would really not be trying to mitigate what are solvable problems that would have been solved in design. So it goes back to what Cecilia is certainly saying, that in building back better, we certainly cannot lionize some of what we have now as the inefficiencies in our infrastructure plan, because certainly a lot of it was developed in the frame of reference of lifting some and not others, right? And if we've learned the lesson over the last 60 years since World War II, that growth alone is not the solution for an equitable outcome. So in this sense, the reframing of the understanding as to what is success in terms of, just as you said, Governor O'Malley, the fact of not, and certainly myself in the water sector, we've been working hard to change the conversation from equity being that of just affordability, because affordability of poor service is certainly not equity, right? And certainly what we're trying to do is in the same vein for all infrastructure. It is not only just about access. It's not just only about affordability. It is really understanding what is the partnership between citizen and infrastructure, and the expectation of that level of service partnership, that contract of America, if you would want to say, between infrastructure and its citizens, to understand that, okay, in the investments that we are saying that we're going to do, because infrastructure, I do believe, is the government's best way to show its value in its citizens, because it is the one structural solution that government has to improve the life of everyone. So certainly it is with that commitment going forward that we can certainly make that difference.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there and say, I always like to joke, I'm a Democrat in Utah, so I'm oftentimes like the most optimistic person in the room. I can see the silver lining in anything. And I'm also, as a Democrat in Utah, I was in the state legislature where we were 80% Republican, 20% Democrat. When I was mayor, my council was Republican. I'm a Democrat. And then I represented the most Republican congressional district in the country that was held by a Democrat. But and in that capacity, I've seen some successes. We've come together to address challenges in our local community. And a couple of observations I had. First of all, data is an incredible catalyst. If you can get the data out there, it tells its own story and it rallies people who want to find solutions. People rally around the data to find solutions. The other thing that I've realized is that solutions, especially to our most difficult challenges, they don't just magically happen on the floor of Congress in the city council meeting. They don't just come out of nowhere and people are just struck by lightning and decide to agree. Every time I've found consensus on really difficult issues, it's been the culmination of months, sometimes years of tough conversations and hard work. So I think this conversation today has been an incredible conversation where we are coming around and discussing the challenges, distilling those challenges down to a finer point. I think the point is that data can be our friend to help us to understand this equity analysis and push us to manage our assets in a way that drives toward greater equity. Governor, I would turn it to you if you have any comments before we conclude, but thank you for bringing us together and for your leadership on this very topic.
And thanks a lot. It's been great to be with all of you, with Mildred and with Hugh and with Cecilia and with David and Michael. Thank you for bringing all of us together. I'll leave you with this final thought, and it is this: nature achieves well-being of the whole through diversity. Ideologues believe the opposite. So I vote with nature. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. And Ben, I'd like to build on what you were saying about data. In 2016, we had working groups on information management. It was one of them. And it was declared that data is an asset. And back in 2016, that was a big deal. Treat your data as if it's an asset. Now everybody who's lost their data understands they have to do that. Now we can introduce the concept that ISO 55000 addresses tangible and intangible assets. Equity should be our most important intangible asset in a democracy. So I look forward to seeing where the conversation with this group and others expands.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
But
you.
let's not stop the conversation. Mildred,
Thank you. Yeah,
You can-
do have to go. So, but thank
Okay,
you
you
so
have
much,
to go.
everyone. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and I love that last one, Mike. Equity is our most important asset, but you forgot my other favorite one. Relationships are our most important assets.
Yes.
Well, I would like,
But in a
For me-
democracy, equity.
for me, I think I'd like to just thank ALN for actually making this a focal point, because usually in the realm of infrastructure, what happens is that we tend to be very much so technically focused, and we then tend to coalesce around those outcomes. But certainly looking on equity as a focal point of infrastructure, certainly this, I believe, will be the catalyst for a new frame of reference for what our investments mean, and really what is that partnership between citizen and infrastructure, and really that bridge between the two is equity.
And a little plug for our program tomorrow, which is focused on water and wastewater. And we've got a white paper on the use of ISO 55000 in that sector. And David Topman will be speaking. He'll be able to, talk more about the ideas that he introduced today. And I don't want to overburden Hugh, but Hugh is also invited to join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. We'll send you a panelist link. So.
Well, and maybe as a final minutes, and should have injected this earlier, but technology does play a role, and as a technology provider, it behooves us to kind of inject this concept of equity, just as if we were talking about water pressure, water flow, bridge stressors. Let's bring in social determinants of justice, and as a former civil servant, utility, we were always looking to our tools, to our technology, to help kind of make us accountable, transparent, collaborative. There's the kind of the binary capabilities of technology to provide an unbiased component. Well, we can now bring in some of these social determinants of health as almost an objective measure as we do our infrastructure prioritization. So I see a role of technology if we start to embrace these concepts and build them into the tools.
David, this is perfect segue to one of our questions about the similarities of agile software development and successful business or government processes. Since you were on the city council, perhaps you can address that, and maybe Ben, who's got the government perspective, can also address that question.
Well, I think, so wow, talk about connecting very diverse bookends, agile software development and politics. Usually don't, politics may not be quite agile, as Governor O'Malley mentioned, but I think what the lesson learned there is, old-fashioned software development was, get all the requirements, do the design, start building, start testing, and potentially you're delivering product, 18 months after you asked for the need, and the needs have changed very quickly, and so Agile says, no, be responsive, build success in very quick sprints, and be adaptive, because then you're always addressing the most topical need in front of us. And with climate change and now what we're understanding about these social determinants of health, an agile philosophy would allow us to start to address the most pressing need that's in the conversation. And I think that sort of agile development where you're kind of building for the most, to almost to Hugh's point of value, right? You're always solving the highest value problem and building that into the solution, rather than waiting for the perfect tool. Your tool is actually usable faster. Ben?
I guess I would add to that, using the other I think area where we can succeed is appropriately partnering with the private sector, right? Government has a role, we have assets, we have opportunities, but oftentimes some of these innovations, especially technological innovations, are coming from the private sector, are powerful tools. And government will but set the guardrails and the direction where we want to see our assets and our opportunities flourish. and then look to the private sector to bring in some of those high-powered technological innovations. I think there are some incredible ideas there. And we're seeing, certainly there's some dangers with that, where we must be vigilant to set the guardrails in a place where we feel they're appropriate and adequate. But I think there's some incredible opportunities. And I look at even at financial inclusion and opportunities to expand financial inclusion to communities and individuals that have been left behind deliberately through redlining and other awful practices, but the opportunity to then extend credit and opportunity to them through financial innovation is a big one, and an opportunity that shouldn't be left aside. Although, again, there are risks, and governments should be vigilant in ensuring that those risks are mitigated and guardrails are in place. But there are incredible opportunities in our future if we can harness our assets and the data that government's in possession of, and individual data with appropriate protections for privacy and safeguards.
Yeah, Ben, that's a great point on financials, or financing, in that with municipal utilities, bonds are a very pressing element in having a good bond rating, and Hugh can attest to that. It's very encouraging to see that Standard & Poor's and Fitch and Moody's are actually looking at, do you have an asset management plan, right? It's almost, to them, that's their almost their collateral, right, in issuing these bond ratings. And so it's utilities are being asked to have a plan almost as collateral for these good bond ratings, which helps with infrastructure investment. So it is you're exactly right. We have to bring in the financial element as well into the conversation.
Yeah, I do believe that the ecosystem certainly is closing in, because from a risk management perspective, asset management is the one thing from an infrastructure management standpoint that best undergirds the management practice. Because certainly, and if you look on it, not only are not utilities, but pretty much agencies that manage infrastructure, we're suffering now from the stability that we've really had for a long time. There's the aging of the management population and the leaving of historical and enterprise knowledge at that same point. The only transference of that is really through an asset management structure that really codifies the principles on which you make decisions, and then also projects the outcomes. And I do think that one of the key tools in terms of understanding the progression of where we're going is really through that analytics chart that Governor O'Malley has shown, which really has been my mentor in asset management. It's the fact that for a long time with infrastructure, we've only been historically focused, right? So we look on how have things failed in the past. And then the only step forward that we've taken in many cases is really just trying to find out why something failed. But then we never really get into that more agile approach, as David is really talking about, where we're really trying to do the prescriptive, preventative interventions that say, let's really design with intent. Let's maintain with intent to ensure that what we know are either repetitive or highly or situations that have a high propensity to occur, that we actually assure that we have mitigation measures, whether that is through structural design or operating practices or actual risk management tools to get that done. And I really do believe at this point now, the challenge that we've had, even though the US in itself has really built its structure on having superior infrastructure, in itself, the management of that infrastructure, we've certainly neglected that. And that's really where I believe that ISO 55000 and the principles of asset management are really the key tools now to say, okay, how do we create a platform on which we really enable and extend that benefit going further? Because what we're seeing right now is that we built it and the life cycle, we never thought about the end of the life cycle. And we're really at the end of the life cycle at this point. And certainly I do believe that in the Building Back Better concept, it needs to be not necessarily just a replacement in kind or just a replacement. We have to think about how do we either extend or maximize that life cycle going forward.
I would like Jim Dieter to make a comment to build off what you just said, because I've heard Jim talk about that so much.
Oh, that's, I got a page full of notes and more from this amazing session. Just a pleasure to be listening to such a group of people and these ideas. And I'm also slightly off your point, Mike, but reflecting that this kind of event is an example of how through all your participation and the requirements of having virtual meetings, we've just had an amazing session that would have been difficult or impossible to replicate in person with the representation that we had, with the involvement we had, and with the ideas put forward. So kudos to Mike for putting this together and for everybody participating. But yeah, we need to figure out how, and I think lots of good ideas here today in terms of how asset management is the solution to the problem that we're all aware of, and how to make others that are unfamiliar with asset management aware that in fact, asset management is the solution or a part of the solution to these problems.
And Jim, you've said that we can't make the same mistakes again. So if you could elaborate on what you mean by that, related to what Hugh was saying about here we are at the end of a life cycle and we don't know what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I alluded to this in my opening comments, but the idea that, we know how to do this stuff, but we haven't done it. And I think I wrote down Hugh's quote there that we have neglected the management of infrastructure. I was like, how come I never said it that simple in that few words? That was, that's like, that needs to be a headline, and how we can take this forward. But if we don't take the opportunity to have asset management as planning, forward-looking, longer view as a part of anything we do in infrastructure, we are really blowing it. We're making a huge mistake. So I hear lots of good ideas today here. And I also am encouraged that it's not like somebody ought to do this. It's like, what can we do? How can we do it? How can we work better to do these things? And people willing to be involved in doing it. And not easy, but we all can make a difference. And we have several pieces of that puzzle right here among us today. And Mike, you were talking about a program about Governor O'Malley's book. Are you still thinking about that? That seems like
that's a good one to segue into, Ben, because Ben and Governor O'Malley connected through Grant Thornton allowing Governor O'Malley to speak for the Government Finance Officers Association on urban growth funds, and we're willing to support whatever you guys are cooking up there.
Yeah, we are talking about this urban wealth fund concept with the government assets that are underutilized government assets as a potentially significant revenue stream that can address challenges like equity, housing affordability, climate resilient infrastructure. And I'm doing this through my organization, Common Ground Institute, that I founded, really on the premise of what I said earlier, that so many of our tough solutions, we expect our elected leaders to find consensus in the moment of a vote. And those who have been involved in consensus building know that it takes months and years to fine tune, the very minute details of any proposal to get people to consensus, and that takes time and that takes effort, and it's through this Common Ground Institute that I hope to be a forum to have those conversations and to find consensus on difficult issues. And one of the issues that we're looking at is this area of public assets, and creating a return on investment on those public assets to address some of these really complex challenges, to bring new resources to the table to address age-old challenges.
Well, one of the things that you said, Congressman McAdams, I'm calling you Congressman now instead of Ben, but you mentioned the business community. When I say stakeholders, that is not just the citizenry. It truly does include all the stakeholders that are impacted, and that would be private sector business citizens, who have both the need for the infrastructure as well as the need for their employees to have the infrastructure. And so if you're taking a true holistic approach, you'll look at both the physical infrastructure needs as well as, I'm sorry, the human infrastructure needs. I thought it was brilliant that that was being brought to the table in the legislation. I wish that we were not such a divided society, that we wouldn't stop and think about it, what it means and the difference that it can make if you take a holistic approach of how do these things tie in together and where are there issues. So I would say one thing, David, we must make sure that you have the advancing equity white paper on advancing equity through asset leadership that goes through that overlay that we're putting on ISO 55001 to make sure that we're digging deeper using ISO 26000 and SDG concepts to really pull out more than the traditional usual suspects for who our stakeholders are, and broadening our mindset so that we can be mindful at all times to bring more people to the table.
But I think a little bit. So yes, I find myself doing much reading these days to educate and come up to speed, because like I said, just traditional education hasn't given us the tools I think we need to respond in today's challenges. But a bit to kind of everyone's points that's been made, and yours and Ben's, and the as again kind of as a technology provider, we've come up. I've been in water most of my life, but I've been involved in lots of different infrastructure, and my own current company, we were purchased by if I can say Autodesk, which is one of the largest providers of tools in the infrastructure management. And one thing we've been talking about internally, though, when we go through the infrastructure bill, we know, all right, there's funding for telco, there's funding for transportation, there's funding for water and lead service lines, and I think people are thinking, oh, well, I'm going to get this funding for that and this funding for that. And at Autodesk, we kind of been thinking, well, why aren't we talking about a holistic right-of-way management, right, to lift the community? I even put a public opinion piece out there on lifting communities, because we can tackle these community challenges. And what a great tool for a city to apply for funding. And I guess that's been a key thing, is we've wanted grants, not loans, right? Let's go back to the 70s and Clean Water Act, and let's get grants, because many communities just can't afford to pay back these loans or know of a certain future to be able to. So grants are going to be what helps lift these communities. And so, but if I'm a community and I'm taking a holistic right-of-way approach, and I said, I am going to do this for this disadvantaged community. I'm going to improve the walkability. I'm going to improve public transportation access. We're going to get with our local internet providers and get the infrastructure in place so they can access and remove that digital divide. And I'm going to get rid of the lead service lines and get a nice street out of it to boot, right, with some bike lanes, right? And so taking this holistic approach, and that's been a challenge for us for decades. We've always had that dream world, but why not have technology kind of build this into our tools so that we can just leverage them without having to build it ourselves, so to speak. So anyway, it's something we're kind of trying to lead the way in this conversation.
Well, this conversation was too exciting to put a time limit to, and many of our panelists have had to move on, and we thank them for their concepts and for participation. We thank all of the attendees who have stayed through all of this. Your attention and sticking around through this the whole time is the most encouraging thing for us. So thank you. And please look forward to other programs in the conference. Like Jennifer said, there's plenty of here to learn from. Jim, Cecilia, and David, any final comments?
Oh,
I was
I'll
gonna
let
say,
you know, David.
I was going to say to answer that the other question about examples of advancing equity to improve resilience. I think the one thing about resilience is always about if you look at the definition, bounding back, right? Being able to come back. Resiliency is this ability to spring back, right? Well, one of the best ways to mitigate an event that requires you to bound back is to prevent that event in the first place, right? And so I think one of the things that we do, if we start taking these holistic approaches, and it's not just infrastructure, it's people, to Cecilia's point, we bring them into the equation, because they're going to be part of that resiliency. It's like, and resiliency means having these ideas to respond, and what better way to be inclusive and bringing all the community together and how we need to respond, that to be able to improve resilience, equity is a key player to increase our idea pool and to actually make that a tenet of avoiding the event in the first place. So
Absolutely. And I guess I would jump on that and say, boy, increasing the idea pool, David, that is so important. And my whole thought on this is, when we look at, having just been at the International Economic Development Council, where we talked very much about these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and knowing that this is a subject matter, not just with us in this area, but everybody is having this discussion and dialogue. This is a time for us to try and do it, to be mindful about doing it, to begin the process of bringing everybody to the table. And I like to say that you can do this issue of building diversity, equity, and inclusion and being holistic in your approach just by doing love by care of others. And that, now this sounds very hokey, love by care of others, but it's an acronym sentence. Learning opportunities, valuing everyone and everything by communicating, accepting respectfully experiences of others. That gets us to that coming to the table in collaboration and getting trust at the center, coming collaboratively, transparently, and thoughtfully to transform towards trust. That will get us moving in the right direction, where we reframe what the design ought to be, where we look at first where we are, whither we are tending. We will then be able to better judge what to do and how to do it.
Well, I can't think of better words to put a bow around it than that. But I did want to ask Nick if he could put up our patron and member slides again, because again, those are the folks that make it all possible for us to get together and have these events. And I think we'll be having these, hopefully, some version of these kind of conversations 30 some times over the next 5 weeks. So thanks again to ABS, Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group, Onuma Systems, and Definitive Logic, our patron sponsors, and to our member organizations. And again, particularly today, Grant Thornton, who made the participation of Governor O'Malley possible. And just, you all are incredible. I'm just, to be able to be a part of creating an event where this kind of people and these kind of ideas come together, and not to complain, but to think about how we can all build a better world, is just, it gives me hope and optimism. So that's all I have, Mike.
That's perfect. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Privilege and a pleasure, guys. Thanks, Nick, for keeping us all together. Great job on the technology.
No problem.
Nick, show your face again. There you are. Thanks, Nick. Good
Yeah.
job.
Mike, get Cecilia's acronym down. That's going to be part of the.
I'm working on it.
All
I'm
right.
trying personally.
All right. Thanks.
All right, bye.
Okay, everybody be well. Thanks everyone for showing up.